It's now my pleasure to lead us into our first session of the day. As I said, it is focused on reclaiming our civic purpose, and the hour in this case is higher education. And this session grows out of a book project that itself grew out of an effort by the Kettering Foundation to bring presidents together to think about reclaiming their role as public voices. And out of that conversation grew a book edited by Katrina Rogers, the president of Fielding Graduate University, and William Flores, the former president of the University of Houston downtown. They brought together a group of authors, many of whom are college presidents, many of whom are community engagement professionals or faculty who have been involved in or have been envisioning campus-wide efforts at change and how higher education can more deeply and more thoroughly contribute to the realization of our highest aspirations for democracy. And so the theme of the book seemed a very close fit for the theme of our conference, which, as you know, is the promise of full participation, democracy, opportunity, voice. And so we thought it might make sense to bring together a few of the people who contributed to this volume and who also are and have been very involved in campus compact efforts or the kinds of efforts that we support on our member campuses. So I am really pleased to welcome our three participants in that dialogue, the three authors, and I will just say a little bit about each one now as they join us visually, and then we will begin a conversation. So Martine Carcasson is a professor in the Communication Studies Department at Colorado State University and the founder and director of the CSU Center for Public Deliberation. His interests are focused on rhetoric and contemporary public affairs and the interdisciplinary theory and practice of deliberative democracy and collaborative governance. Welcome, Martine.
Thank you, Andrew.
Azuri Gonzalez is a community engagement professional of 17 years and a doctoral candidate at the University of Texas, El Paso. She's the co-editor of the Community Engagement and Higher Impact Practices book published in 2018. She's a member of the Metropolitan University's Journal Editorial Board, and she teaches community engagement courses in both women's studies and political science at UTEP. Good morning, Azuri. And Abe Goldberg is executive director of the James Madison Center for Civic Engagement and an associate professor of political science. He previously authored, while living in South Carolina, the South Carolina Civic Health Index in collaboration with Circle at Tufts University and the National Conference on Citizenship. And he has written about the role of colleges and universities in preparing students for active participation in democracy. And good morning, Abe.
Good morning, Andrew, and everybody else. It is great to be here.
So we really envisioned a conversation among the four of us. I have some questions, but I've encouraged our participants in this dialogue to go where they may and not be bound too much by what I've said to connect and engage with each other, et cetera. I say that just so you know they're not being rude if they kind of take that role and start engaging directly. But I wanted to begin by getting some of the ideas that each of you discussed in your chapters in this work out on the table. And Azuri, I thought I would start with you. You write about the importance of developing the capacities of the people leading community engagement work on our campuses in this context of kind of spurring a greater renewal of the civic purpose of higher education. And I'm wondering if you can talk about your own pathway in that regard and some of the conclusions that you've drawn based on your experiences about kind of what it takes to develop that capacity to do this work.
Yes, of course. Thank you. And thank you so much for the opportunity to participate today. I've also participated in the other sessions as a guest, and I think it's been phenomenal, and it's been wonderful to hear from colleagues and to have this experience, having not had the opportunity to go in Seattle. So thank you again. I've been in this role for now 18 years as a community engagement director. And when I started at the Center for Community Engagement, it was not something that came with this very specific job description. And so I had to find my way through this process, as I know a lot of my colleagues have found themselves in that same position. Many people come to this first having been faculty members. Others have emerged coming from student roles, and that was actually the case for me as well. And so after 18 years, and after participating in a number of sessions and conferences and events where we congregate and find our people, as we say, we have many instances where you have those of us who have been at it for a while, and then there's always the people who show up with, I just got this job last week and I'm looking for help on how to do this work. And so it resonates so much because so much of this work has just evolved over time. And so personally, I have seen an evolution of this role, also somewhat parallel to my institution's evolution and the institutionalization of community engagement overall. And so one thing, I guess, that I want to put as a backdrop is that oftentimes in higher education institutions, there's this angst or concern for mission creep, or there's concerns for the next great thing, or the thing that is the buzzword right now. And so oftentimes community engagement has been kind of alluded to potentially being that, something that is just going to come, be popular for one point, and then go away. But in reality, community engagement is something that is so part and necessary of our higher education institutions, because we don't operate in silos, especially when we're working in public higher education institutions. And so we have a role to play in society. And those individuals who can help further that mission, that purpose, are so essential. And so oftentimes faculty will have these partnerships individually with their community partners. Sometimes we do have these larger scale efforts, but oftentimes we require the infrastructure in order to make sure that we are responding to community, we are collaborating, and that we do look at ourselves as important to the revitalization or for the strengthening of our communities. So to answer the question as far as, that evolution and that role, and then also reflecting on the work of Lena DeCilio and colleagues and the community engagement professional book that they came out with, they presented a competency model for what it takes to be this kind of professional. And so it was a fantastic exercise to look at that competency model that has about 100 and some different skill sets, knowledge, dispositions, and to really look at, does it really take all of those skill sets and all those components to be this kind of professional? And so I took some reflective time to look at all of those components and realize that in reality, that really is what it takes to further community engagement in our institutions, from facilitating programming to institutionalizing community engagement, to leading higher education experiences and leadership in this process, to supporting faculty in this process as well, and of course, to build these strong partnerships in the community. So that whole experience and reflecting on it, I've thought about it, and it's like, I'd like to think I'm effective in this role, but it didn't come overnight, and it wasn't something that somebody told me, this is how you do it. I do credit Campus Compact with offering director retreats back in the day, because that was my only sign that there were other people in this role that were also struggling with similar things. But outside of that, there was really nothing that I could say, this is where I learned it. However, what I did reflect on was where I learned a lot of my critical dispositions. And when I learned about my early time in this work and working with nonprofit organizations, I can point to several experiences. And often these experiences were also combined with mistakes on how working with community organizations, we can sometimes create more harm or do more harm by not truly understanding our own positions and in our collaboration with these partners. And so I like to point out to those moments, because 18 years now down the road, and then seeing how the whole field has evolved and how much more professionalized it's become, and I'd like to say also academicized, it concerns me sometimes that we might be removing ourselves a little bit too much from our community and the source of that grounding that is so necessary. Many of us who consider ourselves boundary spanners oftentimes begin with our 1 foot in community and 1 foot in academia. And sometimes, at least it's been my personal experience, I feel like I can a bit too socialized into academia that I forget that we're not the center of the universe. You know, we're higher education institutions, we're one component, one institution in a role in a society. And so we need to play that role and we need to contribute and not necessarily center our conversations or a lot of the work that we do from that lens sometimes. So as we think about reclaiming our civic purpose, I like to go into what ultimately makes us strong. And really, it comes from what we learn from our community and where our community grounds us and where those perspectives can really teach us about where to go. And so I've also witnessed that in this point in time, how as we're all struggling through the same things, our community leads the way, and we just need to be strong enough to support that, and in that process model that behavior for our students. Something that I've heard you say also, Andrew, I've also read that in an essay that you wrote, and I thought that was so important, because not everything has to be so tangible and specifically structured for our students. Just the way that we behave as institutions is a huge model for revitalizing or to strengthen our student civic engagement. So that's generally my perspective, and I'd love to hear more and to contribute to the conversation.
I have just gotten a message that we're having some technical challenges. And so I think we're going to pause for just a moment, fix that, and then return. So hang in with us for just a moment as we work to get the technology worked out. Hello, everybody. We are back, and we apologize for that delay. We understand that something about our Zoom meeting is leading us all to be a little jumpy. We're not actually jumpy. We're relaxed. We're having a good conversation, but we look like something else is going on. So we apologize for that. We hope the audio is good and that you can hear the conversation, and hopefully this will get smoothed out as we go. All right. So thank you, Azuri, for that really interesting introduction into our conversation. And Abe, I want to turn to you. You wrote a chapter with the president of your university, James Madison University, John Alger, and you together address the ways that civic engagement is central to your institution's strategic plan. And I know that at James Madison, you think about civic engagement. First of all, you think about it a lot, you think about it deeply, and you think about it in some ways that are not quite the same as the way we might use it kind of in ordinary language. So I'm wondering, what do you mean by civic engagement at JMU, and how have you sought to integrate it deeply into the experience of students?
Sure. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak about this work that's so dear to all of us. Andrew, I'm going to use the word "we" a lot when I talk about our work, because really what I'm representing is an institutional commitment right now. The Madison Center has an incredible staff, undergraduate democracy fellows that work with us. We work closely with administrators, faculty, staff, national organizations. I often say that, you know, in the work that I do, I get to work with my heroes, and I really mean that. And I include those that are participating in this conference today. We have important work to do, and James Madison University has made a commitment to integrating civic engagement throughout the entire undergraduate experience. And the way that we sort of operationalize that is that we're working very hard to integrate that into our academic mission. We don't want students to think about civic engagement as something extra that they're doing while earning their degree, but that it's part of earning their degree. And so what we've been able to do is develop learning outcomes because, again, we see civic engagement as part of the core learning outcome of the university experience. And so in a lot of ways, we've been working to embed this work into our curriculum. For example, civic learning, we kind of created these using a lot of resources that are out there. We think about, you know, do students have the knowledge that they need to impact changes that they want to see in society? Do they understand what the entry points are to decision making, and do they understand sort of the foundational structures of our democracy? And what are the entry points for them to influence decisions? So we kind of capture that in this category of, you know, are we doing enough to ensure that students are acquiring civic knowledge? We think about it in terms of accruing skills, because we know that to be effective agents of change, that skill development is critical. And we think about, you know, what does it take to go to a local town hall meeting to speak up for something that you care about a great deal? How you organize your thoughts? What experiences do you have in a public forum and speaking about something that matters a great deal to you? And are you backing your claims with research, right? And so again, that's ideally embedded into our curriculum. We think about dispositions and whether or not our students are developing the confidence that they need to influence changes within society, whether at the community, the state, or the federal level. And then, of course, we emphasize behaviors, right? Is that while voting is something that you can do one day a year, in Virginia we have elections every year, but what can I do in May to address an issue that I care about? We know that there's a great deal that students can do to participate in democracy in between election cycles. And so we think about behaviors very, very broadly here. Again, we're trying to integrate this into our undergraduate experience in a lot of ways through the curriculum. So for example, we have a general education program where every JMU student takes a class that focuses on the Constitution. Obviously, being named for James Madison, we feel like we have a special responsibility to educate on the Constitution. And so our students, when coming to us, are taking a class to learn about not only constitutional development, but key constitutional issues that are with us today. And so that's sort of a common experience for all of our students. And then again, because there's this institutional commitment to our work, more and more majors and departments are integrating civic learning into the upper division aspects of our coursework. One example I could give is in our nursing program. The students that come to JMU to get a nursing degree are developing the skills and getting the credentials to become nurses. They're also learning about health policy, and they're learning how to lobby at the state and federal level on policies that are of deep relevance to nurses. And I can't think of a better time than COVID-19 to think about the integral role that nurses are going to have in informing public policy moving forward. But it extends beyond that as well. We have a wonderful art program here where students are given opportunities to take classes called Art and Activism, which I want to take that class so badly. And so again, it's not just the political science and the justice studies, but this is truly something that we're trying to build across our majors. Certainly the School of Media Arts has taken this on. And so we work closely with faculty and academic units to bring that into the curriculum, but then we also recognize there's a really important element to our work that's co-curricular. And so as the director of the Madison Center, we work very closely, and our best friends are the orientation staff. These are wonderful colleagues. The residence life staff, these are, again, are wonderful colleagues who are thinking about how can they bring their work into this civic mission that's been articulated for the university. And so, a quick example of that is we have developed a traveling town hall program where we invite candidates for elected office at the local, state, and even we've had Senate candidates come. And Andrew, they will ride with us in a van. Often two people running against each other in an election will get on a van, eat boxed turkey sandwiches with us, and visit 3 residence halls where students can come down into the common areas of their residence hall, hear from candidates that are running for office, and ask wonderful questions. And then the students get to see these candidates get back in the van together and ride off. And it really sort of demystifies, I think, the project while making it very personal, while bringing the town hall into the common area, which is essentially their living rooms. And of course, we have pizza involved in that as well. But again, we're trying to bring civic learning into spaces where students already are. We have another wonderful program that I love called Tent Talks, where we set up a tailgate tent onto the JMU quad, and typically a tent talk will have a theme, whether it's mass incarceration, immigration. The students come to us with what problems they want to talk about. We don't tell them what to care about. Students already care about these issues a great deal. I don't buy the ambivalence argument. They're not ambivalent at all. They care a great deal about public issues. And so what they're looking for with us is a platform to be able to educate their peers on these types of issues. So we'll set up a tailgate tent, and just as students are walking from class to class, they can stop and have conversations with Madison Center Democracy Fellows about these types of issues. We always integrate voter registration into these programs because we want to build a link between the public issues that students care about into the electoral process in hopes of recognizing that voting is going to be part of this, but also that we can be having conversations about these sometimes contentious public issues in our day-to-day lives. And that's what we're trying to bring into the undergraduate experience. And so again, I think about it as curricular, I think about it as co-curricular, and I think what I'll end on is say that we also have done a great deal of work on our campus climate and making sure that we have a campus climate that is conducive to political learning and engagement. And I have to give a shout out to our wonderful colleagues at the Institute for Democracy and Higher Education, who advised us and several other campuses around the country on taking a very thoughtful approach to making sure that we understand, what aspects of our campus climate that we can capitalize on, and what are some aspects of our campus climate that we need to work on to improve political learning in our campus. So it really is an institution-wide commitment that relies on the support of colleagues within JMU and within our partnering organizations.
Thank you. So, Martine, I think we've heard now some about kind of what it takes to build the capacity of people who are leading work on campuses. And, Abe just took us into a conversation about campus climates and building student capacity for participation and deliberation. And you make a case for the notion that colleges and universities can contribute to the development of a new and more deliberative public climate. And I'm wondering if you could just kind of lay out that case for us.
Yeah, sure. And again, thank you for giving us the opportunity, and I'm glad to be here with Azuri and Abe. I reread your chapters last night. Looking forward to this conversation.
I think we're having some trouble hearing, Martine. I don't know if you can get closer to the mic.
Closer to the mic. Is that better? I wanted to start with a little bit of my own background. So I'm a communications studies professor. Basically, for the last 20 years, I have focused on how do we talk about tough issues, how do our communities engage these shared problems. My earlier work was much more national, focused on the presidency in particular. I grew weary of it because I basically wrote a lot of papers about how badly we talk about tough issues, and didn't seem like a very interesting career to go into. So when I got the job at Colorado State about 16 years ago, I shifted my focus from national to local, and I also shifted from being more of a critic or a commenter on processes to being much more a practitioner. So I developed the Center for Public Deliberation about 13 years ago. It serves as this impartial resource for the Northern Colorado community. I actually train undergraduate students through coursework to be facilitators. We design and run events for the city and school districts as we to try to kind of create the kind of conversations that we know we need to have for democracy to work.
Martine, I think we're still having trouble with the mic. I don't know if you have an all.
Do I want to go in?
That sounds much better.
That sounds much better. I didn't do anything. Okay.
Yes.
I'll start with the broad argument that I truly believe the number one issue that we're dealing with right now in our communities, nationally and internationally, it is kind of the growing hyperpartisanship, the inability for us to talk to each other. And I think if we don't make some progress in figuring that out, all the other issues we care about, whether that's climate, that's inequality, public health with COVID, but we're not going to make much progress with that. So obviously that sets up the argument that I strongly believe our colleges and universities have to focus on that much more, have to see as a key part of their role, particularly in the local community, is supporting better processes to help us engage it. My work overall can probably be summed up with two words, which is process matters. I've spent a lot of time the last 5 years digging into social psychology, brain science, learning how our brains work, and then using that knowledge to develop a process. And a lot of what I've learned from that is most of our processes to engage difficult issues have horrible processes. Right? We're suffering some really bad processes that are overly adversarial, that really, once you understand human nature, that clearly bring out the worst. The good news is that we know better, right? Scholars and practitioners from multiple fields know how to engage people in much more productive ways to deal with their shared problem. My experience with CD, a lot of my colleagues across the country that do this work in public deliberation know that when you bring people together with better processes, we can have these conversations. We can kind of engage issues in much better ways. We just unfortunately don't see that very often. One quick example, just to give a specific aspect of this work. Right now, most political issues are framed either by pundits or political strategists who are more focused on winning arguments and making the other side look as bad as possible versus solving problems. Or they're framed by the media, who often are focused much more on telling interesting stories and attracting kind of eyeballs and clicks. And they both know that framing things in adversarial ways works better for them, and again, brings out the worst in us. But deliberative practitioners know how to frame issues very differently. When issues are framed specifically to focus on elevating our conversations and honoring a broad range of values and sparking collaboration across perspectives, we have a very different conversation. So when we frame issues for deliberation rather than framing them for persuasion, you see a major shift in the quality of the conversation. So the work of the CPD and other organizations like it across the country at the local level are able to shift these conversations from this adversarial to a much more kind of collaborative mindset. So the question becomes, how do we scale this up? How do we provide the resources for our local communities to have these kind of conversations and train all our citizens, not just students, and the skill sets to have the conversations that we need to have. So that's where my chapter kind of lays out that argument in a sense that I believe universities are very well suited to provide this kind of resource. It has the skill set and the mindset to do that. Though it will require significant shift. The traditional model of universities primarily just providing useful knowledge doesn't work in an adversarial relationship. Information is either seen as ammunition for your side or something you could dismiss if it doesn't fit. I talk a lot in the paper or in the chapter about how the ideal of the informed and engaged citizen doesn't work very well in this overly adversarial kind of mindset, right? So I set up a new ideal that I think we need to focus on, of this notion of developing students as wise collaborators, which is a very different skill set that helps us kind of design the process or transform the conversations we have. So I walked through kind of the 3 steps of universities developing a wicked problems mindset. I can get into more if you like. Really seeing their primary role in the community as being this bridging or mediating institution designed to bring people together, which are critical for communities. They don't happen naturally. And then also that notion of developing wise collaborators. I'll stop there.
And just maybe as a follow-up, Martin, so you mobilize a concept of passionate impartiality. I think I have that right. And I think, people, I think especially, in the context of hyperpartisanship and the fear that sometimes trying to find a collaborative space means conceding too much. The idea of passionate impartiality, I can imagine people thinking of that as sort of similar to the both sidesism that people criticize in mainstream media, that they refuse to call out what are real facts on the ground about practices. What is it you mean by that, and what does it take to be a wise collaborator?
Yeah, and so I developed the concept of passionate partiality primarily initially as I was trying to recruit really good students to do my program, right? And part of it was to try to convince them that you can bring those two worlds together. To be impartial doesn't mean you have to be neutral, you have to be detached, or you don't have commitments. So in my chapter, you can kind of imagine that passionate partiality is kind of a triangle of 3 different commitments that we recognize are constantly in tension, but you're having to kind of negotiate these. That's certainly the heart of my work and the CPD's work, but I also think it's the heart of what universities should be dealing with. The top of the triangle is impartiality. I have to develop a reputation for impartiality for me to do the work that I do. People have to trust that I don't have a dog in the fight, and that our goal is focus on elevating the conversation and helping my community work together to solve problems versus convince them. But I also recognize,
Martin, if you could, I don't know if you can try a little closer to the mic again. We're having a little trouble again.
Does that help?
Yeah.
Last time when I put it down, it helped. The bottom left of the triangle is that while we're impartial on a specific issue, we do have commitments to democracy. Small d democracy's commitment to equality and inclusion, voices being heard, are a key aspect of our work. And we're going to work harder to get voices heard. We're going to train our facilitators to make sure voices are heard in process. And then the last leg of passionate partiality is, like universities, we're actually biased towards information and facts and rigor. And so to try to balance those 3, that we're impartial, but we care about voices being heard and equality and inclusion, and we care about quality information. That's the heart of the work that we do. Too often people see that you either have to be kind of an activist or take a perspective, or if you're impartial, you have no commitment. There's a lot of productive ground in between those two. And I think deliberative practitioners are trying to figure out how we kind of better negotiate those tensions. And I think that's something that universities should be thinking about more often as well within this context of such a hyper-partisan reality that we have.
And Martina, I'm about to direct a question to Azuri, but you might want to experiment with pulling out, like going for the internal mic to see if that works better.
I'm going to call in.
Okay, that's a great solution that I didn't think of. Thank you for that. Azuri, so, we've just been talking a little bit about the idea of developing in students these capacities. Abe was talking about it, Martine was talking about it, and in the public for engaging with people across difference and thinking of themselves as collaborators in a public space rather than combatants. And I'm wondering, when you think about the professional development for community engagement professionals, if we are to be people leading that work on campuses, are we cultivating those capacities? Are there places that you see where people can build that skill set among the set of competencies you identified? What's that look like to you?
Yeah, great question. So that's exactly what that process was, as far as reflecting on where I got some of those critical dispositions that I continue to work on. Even though I'm part of my community, I've been a child of the region. I still don't believe that street credibility carries over with you the entire period of time. There are things that privilege us in many ways. And so that continuing checking in is what I think is very important. And the opportunity to check in and the opportunities for checking in, I believe, happen when you are involved in community, with community, but not always in your role as a community engagement professional, but just as a person who also can contribute your skill set, your knowledge as part of a group. So oftentimes, I believe we set up these partnerships or these collaborations as though the institution is one entity and the community is another. And so that positions us in a very odd way, as though the institution is this whole big component in juxtaposition to a community as a whole. And that's not really how it works. So if you put yourselves in situations when you are part of a collective, you're part of a, for instance, I've been involved in women's collective impact work, and I go in as an individual who also contributes to that conversation, not solely as a representative of my institution. I realize that sometimes that creates these challenges when we say, well, the community works with the individuals or works with the faculty. They know the faculty member, but they don't know the institution very well, or they don't consider themselves to be partnering with the institution. And yes, that could sometimes be a challenge, but in reality, that's how trust is built. That's how rapport is built, and that's how the learning happens. And so that's also where some of these deliberative comments are happening, or these discussions, when we come at these tables with as human beings. So I think a lot of the time, one of the parts of the work that I did was with technical assistance for nonprofit organizations, and then also through some work through COPSI, when we used to have a COPSI through HUD. These kinds of grants allowed us to create these, for instance, policy think tanks when we had discussions in the community. And again, we don't put ourselves as the lead in these discussions, but rather as a contributor. And so when we bring and create these spaces for people together, that's when we ourselves are also bringing our own understanding, and then we walk out of there with that learning as well. So I think we have to continue to find those times and spaces where we can build our own understanding and see where we're also making mistakes. Because again, just because we learned it at one point, or we developed a certain understanding of how not to come from a position of privilege, for instance, at one point or another, it doesn't mean it carries over forever. So it's just this continuing checking in and putting ourselves in these real life situations so that we don't forget that we are just one component of community. We are not the other partner in this context.
Abe, I want to connect some of the things that you talked about with Azuri's discussion of kind of making change and the role of community engagement professionals. And it connects to a question that came in from one of our participants. You obviously, the president, having John Alge here, who's a member of our board, who's a national leader in this work and deeply committed at a personal level, that helps. But you also described the level of engagement that you have across departments and programs in staff and faculty. And I'm wondering, what's the bottom up part of this been like? How have you're a political scientist. It's an affliction I share with you. We're kind of sold in advance on this. What was the process of building the level of support to make this real in the work of everybody, as opposed to this being a presidential initiative where people kind of wait it out until the next guy comes?
Yeah, that's a great question, because we do have an incredible amount of support from the president's office, being that civic engagement is a pillar of the entire institution's strategic plan that we're now kind of doubling down on. The Madison Center was created a few years after articulation of that strategic plan. But one thing I want to emphasize is that when the strategic plan was created, and this predates my time at James Madison University, really what I although it is a personal conviction of our president, I think what he was doing and what the entire leadership was doing was really putting into writing and words of something that already existed at JMU. So I get a sense that there already was a critical mass of faculty, students, and alums who cared a great deal about civic engagement. And so in some ways, President Alger coming in was able to name that and bring his own leadership to it. But when I think about the bottom-up aspect of our work, I start with our students. The students that interact with us at the James Madison Center are some of the most thoughtful, bright, outward-facing people I've ever met in my entire life. And I think a lot of campuses have students that are like that. And so I think where kind of the top-down and bottom-up meets is that what our students are hopefully finding with the Madison Center is that when they do have issues that they care about and that they want to act on, or they want to educate their peers on, that there's going to be some institutional support for that, and that we can embrace that rather than kind of pushing it off to the side. Because in a lot of ways, the work that the Madison Center does, whether it is through bringing, candidates to campus, or bringing, conversation on contentious political issues to public spaces, we're bringing this stuff. We're embracing divisive issues, because if you can't do it on a college campus, I don't know where you can do it anymore. You certainly can't do it at a lot of dinner tables. And so the bottom up, I think, provides hopefully support for the students that want to do that. And I think about, as I'm talking about this, the problems that the public problems that students come to us with, and being able to say, okay, well, let's develop some programming around that. Andrew, that's a joy. That's a privilege to be able to say that, okay, that you're at an institution where you are hopefully going to be supported to develop initiatives around that. So the bottom up piece is absolutely critical to us. And it's more authentic that way too, right? It's not for me and kind of the professional staff to tell students what to create programming around. That comes from them.
Martine, so hopefully the phone connection is going to work, so we'll see in just a minute. So, you paint this picture of a kind of frame around wicked problems that need to be addressed, that are challenging, and the idea of the university playing a role as a kind of bridging agent that can bring people together for the kind of dialogue that Abe was just talking about, that is so difficult for us to have. And I'm wondering, and this relates both, we got a question that gets at part of this. I was thinking about an institution like Abe's, where James Madison, who's both, the father of the Constitution and also a slave owner, is kind of the central figure in the identity of the institution. We had a question come in about the role of indigenous perspectives in the kinds of dialogues that you're talking about. And so what I'm wondering is, how do you work with the complexity of the histories of conflict, of oppression that are in some cases a background to some of the issues that now emerge? So the wicked problems are not abstract and just present problems; they are manifestations of deep histories. And I'm wondering, how does that work in the context of dialogue, if it is to remain productive, forward-looking, but also take that kind of history seriously?
Yeah, no, I think that it's interesting to think a lot of the problems that we're working with, I think the wicked problems frame, which the way I use it's more, instead of a category of problems, it's more a lens through which to see problems with, right? So you're working particularly as kind of the passion and partiality to identify all the underlying values that are relevant to an issue and kind of putting them on the table and focus on the inherent tensions between them, right? Too often when we have the dominant adversarial mindset, strategically, you're going to frame things as only certain values are relevant, right? And I've got good values, and those that disagree with me have bad values. That leads to defensiveness. That leads to lack of trust and polarization, and kind of a vicious cycle in a way. So, for all our issues, we're doing that work of, focusing on elevating the conversation by bringing out those tensions and helping people kind of manage them. I think that same process works on tough historical issues, right? If you're looking at historical issues from a more adversarial mindset, and you're have that simple kind of good versus evil frame, which our brains love, it's not going to spark good conversation. It's going to spark defensiveness. It's going to frustrate people. But if you I guess deal with more of the nuance and the recognition of that, do we start engaging those values in different ways and find better ways for us to kind of negotiate those tensions kind of going through. Organizations like Facing History does a really nice job with that. I know National Issues Forum, which creates all these discussion guides, have actually a group of historical discussion guides as well, right? Which are designed for us to have some of these historical conversations in a different way.
And can you say more just about, at a practical level, how colleges and universities play a role in changing that dialogue from the adversarial mindset into a more productive mode of operation?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, can't get into the weeds too much, but a lot of different kind of components of the work we do. Part of it is the overall framework and the naming of the issue, the framing of the issue. Most of our processes are all kind of small group discussions, right, with a facilitator, and that's where the students play such a critical kind of role to allow us to do that. What kind of questions we're asking, going back to passion and partiality and some of indigenous voices and those sorts of things. We have those commitments to democracy coming from a university of inclusion and voices being heard, right? So we can do a lot of work to make sure voices are heard in the background materials, work harder to get certain people in the room. Once they're in the room, certainly kind of work to make sure their voices are heard and they're dealt with, so all those things, there's a tension with impartiality, right? That's part of what we recognize, that we want to make sure that it's not just the usual suspects and who's comfortable with those processes.
Azuri, you all wrote your chapters before most of us had probably envisioned what a global pandemic would look like in our communities. And now here we are, and we've had some time as we are adjusting to this. I'm wondering, if you were to sit down and write it now, what are some things that might look different to you about the kinds of things that professionals in our field really need to know about? Or is there a continuity with, how has all this affected your thinking about what it takes to do this work effectively, and what it takes among our people for our institutions to serve the role within the community that you were describing earlier?
Well, that's of course a very tough question, because we're still in it. We haven't been able to kind of look back and reflect and think through. So the only thing I can kind of come back to or ground myself is that I'm a person first, and other people are people too. And so I'm just reaching within our networks of individuals. And so, for instance, we're just checking in with faculty. We're just checking in with our community partners and see, how are you doing? Not everything is as it seems either. So for instance, I thought that everybody would have just kind of halted all sorts of community engagement. But in reality, we're finding more and more examples of how people have just shifted and quickly moved, because we're working with incredible people who are working with few resources, incredible ingenuity, creativity, mobilization, excitement, passion. All of those skill sets and all of these attributes actually have become strengths also during this time. So it's been amazing to also see how, instead of seeing like, wow, we're affected more so because of this pandemic, there's also this excitement around like, we got this. We're going to keep on moving forward, and we're going to keep on figuring things out. So right now it's more about keeping that ear on the ground and just learning through that process again from our community partners, from our community colleagues, and just learning through that process on how it is that we mobilize ourselves in spite of the circumstances. And so I don't have answers right now in terms of this, other than I just need to keep on learning. I need to keep on listening, and I need to plug myself wherever it is that I can help, because that's the other thing. Sometimes things move so fast, and we're so used to trying to document things, trying to elevate the greatness that is happening, so that we can put a nice story out there, or to recognize faculty. Right now, it's all about just being hands on the ground and about being as responsive as possible. So trying to, quote unquote, get out of the way, but also be helpful when we're necessary. So we're just basically listening out for where it is that we can plug ourselves in without necessarily trying to take over things that are just naturally and organically happening. So I guess it'll be something then to reflect on down the line. But at least at this point, it's really about watching the amazing work that just continues. It's not halted because it's not superficial. It's real. And then our partnerships are continuing because they're necessary. We didn't just generate these issues in our community. We're having these partnerships for a reason. So just like everything else, we adapt and we move forward.
Abe, are there things you've seen this spring that tell you something about how well you're doing, that kind of, were an indicator of where JMU is at, where your students are at, where your people are at more broadly?
Yeah, and I hope we're doing well, right? I mean, I think for everybody participating in this conference, democracy needs us right now. And so as far as, with the changes through COVID-19, I've been very, very proud, though not surprised, of the way in which the university has responded to community needs. Certainly, partnerships that have existed between the local hospital, local nonprofit organizations, with various aspects of our university. It's been delightful to see that, and I'm proud of that. I think universities need to think very deeply what their role is right now to support the community during this pandemic, which again, campuses that have already been focused on community engagement, I think are well primed to do it. And as Azuri said, it's going to take some creativity, right? It's going to take challenging us to do things differently than we have before. But I think at the same time, what we're seeing is just this reminder that there's a shared fate between those of us at the university and those of us within the community. And we ourselves see each other as community members, right? And so, we're going to continue thinking through that. One project that we did some great work on this year was with the census. Harrisonburg, the community in which James Madison University is a very diverse community. People from all over the world have come here through various types of programs. And so, not only are we working on encouraging and our students to count for the census and getting an accurate count, but also that work has led to wonderful, deeper partnerships with our local school systems, the city and county governments, and the nonprofit network, recognizing that this accurate count, the information that's accrued from that is going to lead to funding that could come for the entire community. And that work is going to continue well as the Census Bureau has extended the time to respond. And so, it's created some opportunities, I think, in that regard, Andrew.
Martine, you mentioned among the other problems we're not going to be able to get our arms around collectively without a different kind of deliberative culture is the current challenge of COVID-19. And I'm wondering, are there things, whether specifically in the context of the pandemic or otherwise, that you would point to as bright spots or kind of, some signs of hope? Are there institutions that you look at, or just ways that your own projects have gone? What does it look like when things start to go in the right direction?
I think at the very beginning of COVID, I think there was a lot of hopefulness. People were kind of came together. We're seeing it more and more like the point I made from the beginning of the hyper-partisanship kind of starts taking everything over, right? Some of the polls now are kind of scary if you look at, the divergence on how people are seeing it. The good news is, a big part of my argument is we're not nearly as divided as we think we are. A lot of the division, a lot of the polarization is much more appearance than reality. That's why I think these processes work so well. When you bring people together with a good process and they're face to face having a conversation, we have these wonderful aha moments where people realize, like, wait a second, you're not this caricature in my head of what people that disagree with me think, in a sense, and it's pretty easy to undo. So that's one thing that always kind of keeps my hope going, in a way that we know if we stop kind of supporting these bad processes and replace them with better processes, that there's a lot of agreement there. And you see on some of the polls, the media is going to highlight the conflict, right? The media is going to, whether that's social media or regular media, that's what's interesting to people. But we're still seeing in polls that a really high majority of people support a lot of the advice of the health experts on what we need to do. Those just aren't necessarily as interesting stories. So I'll go back to, how do local communities kind of help people have those kind of conversations? I think with COVID, there's lots of values that are relevant to this conversation. Clearly, public health is the number one value that we need to be prioritizing right now. But people that have concern about the economy, people that have concern about overreach of government and freedom, those are all valid concerns, right? So as we kind of continue on this, how do we start figuring out our job is to negotiate the inherent tensions between all these things, versus taking the easy route that our brains prefer, is just picking one of them and assuming, I care about health, so you don't care about health. You just want people to die. And those things work well to win arguments, but they don't work well to solve problems.
One of the questions we had that came in was about the idea of the sort of risk of a focus on the local becoming, in the student experience, a certain form of gentrification, where students are kind of coming in and learning in a way that is not shared by members of the community, whether that's in rural settings, urban settings. And I'm wondering, Azuri, what are your thoughts about that, given the students you work with, the communities, the level of integration that you've tried to achieve, and the way you approach community engagement?
Well, it's interesting because the majority of our students are commuter students, and they're from the region. We do have, I want to say about 7 or 8% of our students who come from right across the border, from Ciudad Juarez in the U.S.-Mexico border. And then we do have a percentage of students who are international students. So their experience is all very different. But even for a 78% Hispanic serving institution, even the experience among those who are Hispanic, Latinos, Chicanos is very different. And so even though they're all technically from the region and community, they all have very different understandings. And so, for instance, I observed some of the experiences that are shared among students who live in different parts of town, and how even there's stereotypes about the different parts of towns. And the assumptions that are made about people who are coming from different parts of towns. And I guess what I'm saying with that is that the intent on understanding the communities where we're integrating ourselves into isn't just geographical in terms of outside city, outside state, outside nation. That can really happen even just among neighborhoods. And just because you know one neighborhood in one community doesn't mean you understand another neighborhood in another community. And just because you've worked with one neighborhood association does not mean you're going to be able to work with a different neighborhood association. So it's this understanding that whatever assumptions you may come with, they might be completely wrong. And just because you're part of the community doesn't mean you understand that particular community. So I guess my response to that is that careful attention to where we are and what we're learning and how we're learning needs to be at all moments and at all times. And that's why, as I was thinking about the professional development of community engagement professionals, there's all these skill sets that are fantastic and we can continue to learn them. But the ones that I think are most critical are the ones that you can only learn by doing and by making mistakes and by listening. And so that's the same exact process that our students need to go through. So understand that we're going to have to learn through this process. There's no way to, fully prepare and instruct, because even as instructors, even as teachers, we're not going to fully prepare them for that understanding. We just need to practice and understand that we need to listen and that we don't know a lot. And so that we need to make sure that as we walk in, we're learners and we understand our positions and how we might be viewed. So at least we have a better way of figuring out how to interact in that learning process.
Well, that is a great note to end on, as I think we are basically at time. And I really appreciate all of your contributions, both in this conversation. Again, the book that all of this is drawn from is Democracy, Civic Engagement, and Citizenship in Higher Education, Reclaiming Our Civic Purpose. It's edited by Bill Flores and Katrina Rogers from Lexington Books. And the chapters of the three who are here today and many others, very, very worthwhile. So I encourage people to run that down. And I appreciate everybody hanging in there through our technical challenges. It is the vagaries of technology. So we did what we could, and we really do appreciate people sticking around, sharing questions, etc. Our next session will be coming up at 12:30, so we have a 15-minute break. It is the session focused on learning from Seattle and other cities, place-based community engagement for justice and equity. So Azuri, Abe, Martina, I want to thank you again so much. Really appreciate your being here with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.